Great. I'd like to thank you all for coming today, and especially distinguished guests sitting in the front row. My name is Chris Clague. I'm a managing editor with the Economist Intelligence Unit. We're the research and analysis arm of the Economist Group, which publishes the Economist newspaper that the Assemblywoman spoke so kindly of. We're proud of that. I'm sort of as part of a separate part of the group. I don't work for the newspaper, but I work for the think tank. So we've undertaken research into the economic impact of artificial intelligence, and specifically machine learning, on 5 individual economies, so the US, UK, Australia, South Korea, and Japan, and then developing Asia as a whole. The objective of this project was to chart a middle path between the optimists, or the techno-optimists, and the pessimists. I'm not familiar with the debate that is ongoing in Korea over the effects of AI, but in the English-speaking world, and in English-speaking books and articles and academic papers, there's sort of largely two groups of people. On the one hand, you have the techno-optimists who believe that AI is going to solve all of the world's problems without creating any problems of its own, and we're heading towards a techno-utopia. That's something of an exaggeration of that position, but it's not that much of an exaggeration. On the other hand, you have the techno-pessimists. Now, these are people who say that AI is going to create immense disruptions to the job market, and that we're staring down a jobless future once AI becomes more advanced. Now, neither side of this debate is really proving very helpful for helping to inform policymakers who are responsible for shaping the policy that will address the downsides which are there, but which also need to be in place to help promote the upsides of artificial intelligence, because there are both. So the idea was to find a middle ground between these two sides and help to inject facts and reasoning into a debate that sometimes doesn't have either of those. Now, the reason we took the approach of having 3 scenarios is that a single forecast is not going to capture all of the various elements that need to be considered when discussing the impact of artificial intelligence. The history of forecasting is not a great one. So a single forecast out to 2030 we didn't feel would be very helpful. Instead, we chose to address the issue using 3 scenarios. 2 of these scenarios are positive. They assume that policymakers get the policy right, that there's investment in AI and technology, that these countries that are included in the research create the educational environment for their citizens that allow them to participate in the labor market of the future. The negative scenario assumes that the policymakers don't get it right, and that the workforce of the future is not equipped to enter the labor market or to create value in a time when AI is making advances. Just a brief note on the 2 indicators that we used for our research. One of them is GDP growth, and the other one is labor productivity. There's a third, which I think everybody is most interested in when it comes to the impact of AI, and that's the labor market, employment. We had numerous discussions about this when the research started, and because AI and machine learning are fundamentally different from past technologies, we didn't feel that we could use historical labor data to make a forecast for the future. So we talk about the impact of employment in the labor force qualitatively in the paper, but it's not part of our econometric scenarios. And I'm sure that's going to be a topic of discussion for the panel following my presentation here. Now, those 2 indicators, GDP growth and productivity were compared against, the results of those scenarios were compared against the Economist Intelligence Unit's baseline forecasts. So the EIU has economic forecasts for 203 countries throughout the world. So what we did is we used those forecasts as a baseline, and then we compared the difference of the scenarios for AI versus our baseline forecast. And that sort of serves as a foundation for the analysis that you can find in the report. In addition to that, we also looked, also qualitatively, at four sectors of the economy. Manufacturing as a whole, I understand that's very broad, but we tried to capture as best we could the impact of artificial intelligence on manufacturing. Transportation gets a lot of attention because of the advances in AI and how that's driving us, pardon the pun, closer to a driverless future, autonomous vehicles. Healthcare, and then finally energy. So I'll speak about those at the end after I go through each of the scenarios. And then finally at the end, we have recommendations not just for policymakers, but for the companies themselves that are responsible for developing and or using artificial intelligence and machine learning. We believe there are some areas for improvement, and we hope that those improvements get made. Okay, so scenario one. The assumptions we made for scenario one, which is a positive impact scenario, is that there's increasing complementarity between labor and machine learning. So a lot of the concerns, or a lot of the people who view AI as a threat, believe that there's going to be a divergence here rather than a convergence. That the labor market is not going to be able to provide skills that complement AI. And so AI, in turn, is going to supplement a large part of the labor force. We don't assume that latter case. We assume that the labor force becomes a complement to machine learning and AI and other forms of technology rather than something that's going to be supplemented. How does this happen? Or what's the other assumption that underpins this? We assume that there's going to be greater upskilling in the labor force through tertiary education. Now that does not necessarily mean university education. It can mean vocational education, so learning a craft or a trade. Both of them will be important. I suppose I could pause here for a second to talk a little bit about education because it's an important part of this overall project. When people talk about education, especially in recent years, I think the buzzword is STEM education, technical education, science, engineering, math. Those are important. The report doesn't dispute that those skills are important, and we shouldn't stop, no country should stop pursuing greater levels of education in these areas. But it's also, at the same time, important to remember that a lot of what AI does is going to require a large measure of human judgment, or human judgment will be an important part of AI and machine learning and how it's used. And machine learning and judgment, not that they're not taught in the technical areas, but I think come in a lot of ways from the liberal arts. They come from studying literature and philosophy and history and politics. And if we neglect those aspects of the education system, I think in a lot of ways the judgment of the people who are responsible for AI and machine learning will be lesser, if not impaired. So that's just a brief side note. And then the other assumption in scenario one is that computer capital, which we use as a proxy for machine learning, is basically at the baseline. Now this is important to point out because in the other positive scenario, we assume that investment in computer capital increases quite a bit. But in this one, we left it at our baseline forecast because we wanted to capture the effects of upskilling of the labor force, primarily. So these are the results in terms of productivity. Now a little bit of background on this idea of productivity, or the level of output per hours worked among the labor force. Over the last 2 or 3 decades, we've seen productivity stagnate in large parts of the developed world. At least since the 1980s. South Korea, I think the productivity stagnation in South Korea came long after that, but now Korea is in much the same situation as the US, Europe, Japan, and other developed countries. So productivity has stagnated and over the last 20 or 30 years, and nobody can quite figure out why. We've had all of these great advances in technology. As the report points out, anybody who grabs the phone in their pocket will see immediately the great advances in technology that have occurred over the last 20 or 30 years. But they haven't showed up in improved labor productivity, at least in large parts of the world. And nobody can quite figure out why that is. So that's sort of an important background there. On the one hand, there are people like the economist Tyler Cowen, who makes the argument that over the course of the 20th century, a lot of the productivity improvements came from what he calls low-hanging fruit. So easy advances that could be made to improve labor productivity. And now we've reached the point in economic development in a lot of countries where there's no more low-hanging fruit. That to wring productivity improvements out of the labor force requires a lot more difficult decisions and a lot more investment than it did in the past. So you see here from the results, the gray bar on the left is the EIU baseline forecast, and then the red bar on the right is the results of the scenario. In this scenario, Australia benefits the most out of all of the countries that we covered. Why is this? Well, for one reason, the scenario assumes upskilling or a great increase in skills in the labor force. Australia has tended to lag behind other countries in the OECD, for example, in the level of skills development. So by injecting more skills into the Australian labor market, productivity improves much more against the baseline than it does for most other countries. In developing Asia, the improvement over the baseline is okay, not nearly as great as Australia. And that's because we assume that in large parts of developing Asia, the sort of upskilling that is required will be very difficult because of the educational infrastructure, or lack thereof, in a large part of developing Asia. So that's sort of a message for policymakers in those countries. Although in some instances, AI is not necessarily as big of a threat or risk to their labor markets because they still enjoy low costs of labor, or at least costs of labor that are low enough to be competitive against forms of automation. The UK, if you look at the UK, you see that our baseline forecast for the UK is for productivity growth to turn negative. Largely, this is because of Brexit and the hit that will give to the financial services sector, which is the most important sector for the UK economy. The Brexit will mean that, if and when it occurs, will mean that a lot of the advantages that the UK enjoys in terms of financial services will go away. Investing in upskilling and AI will turn productivity growth slightly positive in the UK over the next 15 years. I should mention that, I'm sorry, I failed to mention that the forecast period for this is to 2030. So what you're looking at in this chart and subsequent charts are the differences in productivity growth and GDP growth compared to this year and 2030, or sorry, last year and 2030. And then you can see on the right, next to developing Asia, is South Korea. Because South Korea has a very strong base of human capital, lots of education, some may even say an education bubble, there are already an existing number of highly skilled people in Korea. So while Korea will benefit from changes in its educational system, the benefits in South Korea will not be nearly as great as they would be in a country like Australia or in developing Asia. So this is the second scenario, the second positive scenario that we ran for this research. This one does assume increased investment in computer capital, and that computer capital grows at a country-specific rate, which means that some countries will see their computer capital grow more than others, both because they have capital available to invest, and in some cases because their level of capital is so low right now. In computer capital, we assumed slightly higher rates of growth over the next 14 to 15 years. This also assumes tax credits, particularly in the developed world, that will influence and motivate more companies to make investments into machine learning. Greater access to open data. This is quite important topic, not only for this scenario, not only for AI, but in general. Right now, the world, all countries throughout the world are contending with the issues of data protection and data privacy, and particularly cross-border data flows and the availability of open source data. It's quite important, and I'll talk about this a little bit towards the end, it's quite important that policymakers get this issue right. It's on the same level as education and skills in terms of dealing with the impact of AI. And in this one, it's encouraging AI to become more influential and more impactful across society. Right now, there are, we think, legitimate concerns about data privacy and data protection, but at the same time, we believe there are things that can be done to ensure both privacy and protection and open source data and cross-border data flows. And then the final assumption here is that advances in efficiency drive down hardware costs. So the results here versus the baseline are the better of the two positive scenarios, which is to say this investment in computer capital, ensuring that there's cross-border and open data flows and open source data, has actually a bigger impact in isolation compared to just investing in skills and education. You see again, Australia benefits the most from this, but every country sees fairly significant benefits by investing in computer capital. Now, countries like Japan and South Korea have been investing in this area at a rate of 8 to 12% over the past 15 to 20 years. We assume that will continue, if not accelerate, over the next 14 or 15 years. Okay, so this is the assumption that most people are interested in. And this one assumes that AI, there is a great substitution effect for labor. And why is this? Policymakers don't make efforts to improve the skills above 2016 levels. So it assumes that skills are stagnant for the next 15 years. And then that will create a situation where it's much easier for AI and machine learning and automation more broadly to substitute for the labor force, for large parts of the labor force. And that substitution accelerates because we assume that the number of, or the share of tasks that machines can perform increases relative to the baseline, and that hours worked fall due to involuntary unemployment. These are people who want to work but aren't able to find jobs because AI can do their jobs better and at a much lower cost. So this is the negative scenario, and again, it's important to emphasize that this is relative to the baseline. So if you look at the US will still grow, their economy will still grow over the forecast period, but growth will be about half of what we forecast if they fail to take the right policy steps. The UK will see significant negative growth over the period. Australia, negative growth. South Korea, almost no growth at all. And developing Asia will see their growth. We'll see their growth suffer relative to our baseline. So I think the point here is that investment in computer capital and tax credits, while quite important on the upside, education and skills helped to protect a lot against the downside, right? I think that's one of the key takeaways from this research. I'm going to skip over this and come back to our conclusions and recommendations, and just go briefly through the 4 sectors that we looked at. for this research. The first one is transport. I think this gets the most attention when it comes to talking about AI and machine learning, because it's something that enables or will enable autonomous vehicles. That's sort of a big ticket item, a big, bright, shining issue. We believe over the next 14 to 15 years, actually, there will be improvements that are enabled by AI that are not as sexy as autonomous vehicles, but make day-to-day improvements in efficiency and safety. So rail, aviation, shipping, all of them are already using various forms of artificial intelligence. The one area that there's risk, and this is true really across all of the 4 sectors, but is particularly acute when it comes to transportation, is that the more connected our transportation networks become, the more prone they are to security risks. So that's something, particularly with rail, road networks, aviation, can actually lead to an increase in danger if the security issue is not gotten right. The case study that we have in the report is an interesting one, and it's about one of those sort of those small improvements in efficiency that don't receive as much attention as autonomous vehicles. Right? And the case study is of the MTR, the Hong Kong Metro. And what they did is they created a model of the entire metro system and the maintenance schedule, and they automated it so that there was less time down on trains, everything was made more efficient, and it led to cost savings, but it also led to safety savings as well, because a lot of maintenance in the rail system has to do with maintaining the safety of the rolling stock and the engines that drive the metro. In the energy sector, the biggest benefits, at least in the near term, in the upstream, will come in terms of selecting the right fields for producing the fields that have the potential to produce the most oil and gas, the ability to maintain the network for extracting and shipping energy. And then in downstream, equipment maintenance, health and safety, I think the most interesting thing here that AI can do, while it will help to improve the extraction of fossil fuels in the near term, over time, it's actually going to enable more and better use of renewable energy. So one of the biggest problems with renewable energy is intermittency, which essentially is a fancy word for the fact that the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, right? So that hurts the ability of renewable energy to provide base load capacity to electric grids, for example. What some energy companies are starting to do is using AI and machine learning is to model energy use and to better manage the electricity grid so that they can incorporate more renewables into their energy mix. So near term, probably the biggest impact is on the extractive industries when it comes to energy. But over time, it should enable or should promote the use of more renewables in every country's energy mix. The case study that we have in the report, or the company that's referred to in the report, actually doesn't do any of those things. But it does do something interesting, is that one of the problems managing energy markets, or particularly oil markets, is that very few people or no one has a very good view on what the actual global supply of oil is. And that's because a lot of inventories sit in vast storage tanks across the world. and nobody knows exactly how much is in each one of these storage tanks. So what this firm did using machine learning is they developed a way to estimate the volume of inventories in these vast oil storage tanks across the world by looking at the shadows cast in each one of the tanks and using it as a means of estimating how much oil was contained in each one of those tanks. So in doing so, they help to make the market more efficient because there's a better view on what the total global supply of oil is. Excuse me. Manufacturing. This is probably the most controversial or the most debated area when it comes to machine learning and automation more broadly, by which I mean robotics. Robotics have largely already had the most impact they're already going to have in the developed world. There's still room for them to be employed in a lot of sectors, but if you think of something like the automotive sector in the US, where robotics have been in place for 3 decades now, the concern is that automation and software is now going to lead to further decreases in employment and wages, particularly in the developed world, through machines that build machines, machines that build products. We acknowledge that because I think you need to acknowledge that because automation has had an effect on employment and wages throughout the world. In the US in particular, over the last 2 or 3 years, the debate about employment and wages has largely been about trade and globalization. This might be a factor, or this might be a product of the knowledge and intelligence of US leadership, but actually the impact of automation has been just as great, if not greater, on employment and wages in the US as trade and globalization. It hasn't been discussed nearly to the extent that it needs to yet, but I believe that conversation is coming. I'll be interested to hear from the panelists what the discussion has been like in Korea. We talk about a Chilean firm here that uses AI to produce animal products. I think that's interesting, but there's also another case study in the report from GE that talks about how companies are making sort of using AI and machine learning to create, I forget what the exact terminology was, but sort of synthetic replicas of parts and even whole products. The example we use in the report is GE created an AI and machine learning algorithm that mirrors their jet engines for planes so that they can time their maintenance schedule so they can see where problems are and they can increase the safety of those engines. So that's another sort of important area where AI is helping to make advances. I'll end with healthcare here before going back to the conclusions and recommendations. 2 segments of the healthcare space. One is the development of pharmaceuticals and medicines. The other one is the operation of healthcare services, particularly hospitals. Pharmaceuticals, I think there's a lot of excitement in this area and the ability of AI and machine learning to conduct faster literature reviews of all of the research and science that's been done around a particular disease or a particular product. And to conduct virtual trials, much the same way that GE creates virtual replicas of their jet engines. AI and machine learning algorithms allow or enable healthcare companies to do the same, simulating the effects on humans, the efficacy of medicines on humans. Although a lot of pharmaceutical companies are using AI and machine learning methods for these purposes, they have not gotten a medicine to market yet using this approach. That isn't to say it's not going to happen soon, but as of yet, they have not used these methods for creating a new medicine. In terms of healthcare services, which is also the area where our case study comes from, AI has can provide a lot of benefits to the health system planning. So timing where doctors should be, when they should be working, what are the peaks and troughs of when people get ill and types of illnesses that affect them. Pandemic planning is sort of that, but on a larger scale for low frequency, high impact events, whether it's the bird flu or some global pandemic that's broken out. And then triage and diagnostics. The area where it's already providing efficiency improvements can be seen in this company out of the UK called Babylon. So they offer a service that enables patients or potential patients to interact with an AI to determine their symptoms and whether it's necessary for them to come in and visit a physical doctor. And what this problem is solving is that there's a large number of patients who go to see doctors who don't need to go see doctors. And what this company does is helping to determine who those are to ease the burden on the national healthcare system in the UK. It also, on the medicine side, it helps to reduce the incidences of overdiagnosis, which are high depending on the season and the illness. Although there are concerns about data and privacy, which I'll turn to that in a minute when I go back to the conclusions and recommendations. Okay. So there's two sets of conclusions and recommendations we reached here. One is for general messaging and outreach when it comes to talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning, and the other one is particularly for policymakers. Messaging and outreach, the first one is managing expectations. And I think this is one of the, as I said at the outset, this is one of the key themes or the key objectives of our research, was to sort of chart a middle path and manage people's expectations about what's actually going to happen when it comes to AI and machine learning. There will be obvious benefits, great benefits that come from it, and there will be some issues and problems that arise. It's good to acknowledge both. And that's the third point here, is acknowledging the risks. This is particularly true for companies that develop artificial intelligence and have an interest in promoting the idea that AI and machine learning are unalloyed goods, and any problems that they will create can be very easily solved. While we don't think the impact of artificial intelligence is going to be as dramatic as the pessimists do, there are still risks and there will still be issues involved, and they need to be acknowledged. And they can be acknowledged through better communication. AI and machine learning are difficult concepts to understand. What they are, what they do, how they are made. Like a lot of difficult things, a lot of difficult topics, they're really hard to explain to people in simple terms. But that's important because this is going to be, the impact of AI and machine learning is going to be one of the defining issues in the next 15, 20, 25 years. And the public needs to be better educated about that. That will come through better communications. The final point here, the second bullet point from the bottom, is improving trust and transparency. Already in some countries, in particular in the United States, at least those are the stories I'm most familiar with, there have been some issues with the way that AI and machine learning algorithms were used to make decisions, particularly in the criminal justice system, but in other parts of the country or society as well. There needs to be full accounting and transparency of what's being done in order to earn the public's trust. Now, there's a somewhat thorny issue here about divulging intellectual property. And we acknowledge that that's a very difficult issue, and that a lot of these companies have proprietary algorithms that they don't want to release. That makes sense, we acknowledge that, but there has to be a better balance found than what we currently see. The last 3 points I'll make wrapping up here are for policymakers. I think I've already made the point that it's important to invest in skills and training, but let me reiterate one key point. STEM skills, while very important, are not the only skills that are going to be necessary. They are important, and people should learn math and science at a greater rate than they are right now. But it can't come at the expense of subjects that enable people to exercise better judgment. Because as AI and machine learning become more prevalent, become used more often, it's going to require a greater level of human judgment, and that comes from the liberal arts as well. Dealing with data, this is a privacy and security issue. For AI and machine learning to advance and provide the benefits that it can provide, there will need to be data available to feed the creation of these technologies. And if people are not, if citizens of countries are not safe or don't feel safe and secure in the provision of data, whether it's within a country or between countries, then we're going to see a greater backlash against the availability or the making public of people's data. And finally, investing in R&D and technology. In large parts of the developed world, the majority of, or majorities might not be the right way to put it, but public sector investment in R&D spending, not in every country, but in many countries, has gone down over the past 2 or 3 decades. And a lot of that gap in R&D spending has been made up by the private sector. The public sector has been responsible for a lot of great technological developments. GPS, a lot of the technology you have in your smartphones were really developed by the government, and if not the government alone, in collaboration with the private sector and academia. Investing in R&D and technology is important because it takes some of the burden off of the private sector, but it also means that we're not relying on the private sector alone to develop new technologies, because I think there are some risks that are involved there. I'll stop there and look forward to hearing your comments and questions during the panel discussion. Thank you.